Hello and welcome to today's edition of World Panorama. All the biggest international news stories that made headlines this week coming up ahead. I'm Aishwarya with you and here are the top stories. Kyriakos Mitsotakis is sworn in as Greece's new Prime Minister. Victory for his New Democracy Party brings end to 4 years in power for Syriza government of Alexis Tsipras that was marked by turbulent relations with the EU. Concerns over Iran's nukes as IAEA confirms Tehran has enriched uranium past key limits. Tensions between Iran and UK rise after allegations that Iranian boats attempted to seize a British tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. Talks between Venezuela's government and Guaido-led opposition to end political crisis conclude in Barbados. Two sides resolve to continue negotiations to resolve stalemate resulting from Maduro's disputed 2018 re-election. Controversial extradition bill is dead, declares Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam after a month of protests. Protesters not appeased vow to carry on with their demonstrations. An Australian government pledges to hold a referendum on recognizing Indigenous people in the nation's constitution, says it hopes to achieve bipartisan support on the landmark vote within 3 years. The top story this week. Kyriakos Mitsotakis was sworn in as Greece's new Prime Minister on Tuesday. This after Sunday's snap election saw Mitsotakis crushing leftist Premier Alexis Tsipras, who admitted defeat after 4 years in power. It was Greece's first parliamentary election since emerging from 3 successive international bailouts as it continues to struggle with a crippling, nearly decade-long financial crisis. Mitsotakis has vowed that the country would proudly enter a post-bailout period of jobs, security and growth.
Kyriakos Mitsotakis is the new Greek Prime Minister. This after voters gave his New Democratic Party a parliamentary majority on Sunday. Mitsotakis' New Democracy Party had 39.8% of the vote compared to 31.5% by Alexis Tsipras' Syriza party. This gives New Democracy an outright majority as the winner receives 50 extra seats in parliament. Mitsotakis said that he had received a strong mandate which will help him change Greece and implement a program of fewer taxes and more jobs and investments.
I set my ambitions very high. I think we're ready for a big leap forward, and I think that Greece over the next 4 years could be the pleasant success story of the Eurozone.
Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras admitted defeat. Tsipras had called the elections in May after suffering defeat in the local and European votes.
We fought and achieved a lot, always with a head held high, and again with a head held high we accept the people's verdict. With the heads held high because we know that the Greece we hand over to new government has nothing to do with the Greece we took over.
However, turnout in this election was about 57%, one of the lowest figures in decades. The reason being that there have been half a dozen elections in recent years. It was the 6th time in just a decade and the first time since Greece successfully exited its bailout program in August 2018 that Greeks went to polls to elect a new government.
If you ask me, it's a concentrated resentment towards an economy which wasn't growing fast enough, policies that were very restrictive towards entrepreneurship, job creation wasn't fast enough, the growth of the economy was very constrained, contrary to expectations of a rapid growth of in excess of 4%.
In 2015, Alexis Tsipras seemed like the figure of change as he swept to power. vowing to tear up Greece's bail program and end austerity. However, under pressure from the EU and the threat of Grexit, that is, departure from the euro, he was forced into a humiliating U-turn and ended up signing up a third $100 billion bailout and more austerity. Tsipras faced a revolt from within his party as a result and responded by calling fresh elections, which he won. However, his party's popularity was dented as unemployment increased and Greece's economy shrank. Mitsotakis' New Democracy Party has promised to lower taxes and privatize services in the country, which is still feeling the effects of the 2008 financial crisis. Greece has been in receipt of a series of bailout programs over the past decade, which it officially exited last August as economic growth returned. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Iran nukes are back in focus again after the UN nuclear watchdog IAEA said this week that Iran has enriched uranium beyond a 3.67% purity limit set by the 2015 nuclear deal with the major powers, confirming a move previously announced by Tehran. At the emergency meet called over the issue, however, Iran blasted the US, saying that it was facing economic terrorism from Washington with its sadistic sanctions. Meanwhile, tensions between Iran and Britain also rose after UK claimed that Iran's military vessels tried to seize a British oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, backing off only after warnings from a British warship.
Further escalation of tensions between Iran and US. This after revelations that Iran has enriched uranium beyond the key limit dictated in its 2015 deal with major powers. The move was confirmed by the UN's nuclear watchdog IAEA that Iran had breached the 3.67% enrichment limit. The development came after Iran said on Sunday that it was fully prepared to enrich uranium at any level and with any amount, unless it secured European help in the face of crippling US sanctions. This is the second major breach of the stipulations of 2015 nuclear deal or JCPOA. Last week, it was confirmed that Iran had also exceeded the agreed size of its stockpile of uranium.
The reason we are starting our second step in the reducing our commitments from the JCPOA is that Europe and other members of the JCPOA could not meet our demands, especially in the field of oil and bringing back our income. They haven't been able to do anything worthy.
The US called for a special meeting of the IAEA Board of Advisors and called for punishment of Iran for its breaches of the deal. Iran responded that it faces economic terrorism from the United States with its sadistic sanctions.
The United States has not only withdrawn from the JCPOA and violated its own commitments, but through political and economic pressure, prevents international community, states and private entities to implement their commitments towards Iran.
The meeting concluded with no consensus, but President Donald Trump warned the US will substantially increase sanctions on Iran.
But we've implemented the strongest pressure campaign in history against the Iranian regime, and we are not done.
Amid these developments, on Thursday again, tensions in the region rose after UK accused Iran of trying to seize one of its vessels near the Gulf. UK government said that Iranian boats tried to impede the British oil tanker before being driven off by a Royal Navy ship. Iran denied any attempted seizure. Remember this coming after British Royal Marines helped the authorities in Gibraltar seize an Iranian oil tanker. Because of evidence, it was heading to Syria in breach of EU sanctions. Iran that time threatened to retaliate.
You Britain are the initiator of insecurity. You are so hopeless that when one of your tankers want to move in the region, you have to bring your frigates to escort it because you are scared.
The latest moves come after a series of attacks on oil tankers in the Gulf region in May and June that the US and UK blamed on Tehran. The Trump administration, which has pulled out of an international agreement on Tehran's nuclear program, has reinforced punishing sanctions against Iran. Its European allies, including the UK, have not followed suit. Nonetheless, the relationship between the UK and Iran has also become increasingly strained after Britain said the Iranian regime was almost certainly responsible for the attacks on 2 oil tankers in June. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Big story from Venezuela, where talks between Nicolas Maduro government and the opposition led by Juan Guaido to resolve the country's political crisis took place this week. However, no deal has so far been reached, with Norway, that is acting as a mediator between the two sides, saying that the talks are going to continue. The two sides have been engaged in a bitter power struggle since January, and preliminary talks held in May in Oslo petered out without an agreement.
Talks resume between Venezuelan government and the opposition to resolve the country's political crisis. This after preliminary talks held in May in Oslo petered out without an agreement. The meeting between the two sides is being hosted by Barbados. The Norwegian Foreign Ministry is again acting as a mediator, as it did at the previous meeting in Oslo. President Nicolas Maduro and opposition leader Guaido have been at loggerheads since January this year, when Guaido declared himself as interim president, arguing that the elections which had returned Maduro to power for a second term in 2018 had not been free and fair.
I think that the opposition and the negotiations are increasingly leading to how do you achieve some sort of midway accommodation where you accept some of the Chavistas, as they're called, and at the same time you're able to move peacefully toward a resolution of this conflict.
The Venezuelan government says talks concluded successfully, though it did not provide further details. Ahead of the talks, European Union's representative to the OPEC nations, Enrique Iglesias, met both Maduro and Guaido. The EU, which leads an international crisis group with South American nations, hopes Iglesias can help find a way to resolve the crisis. However, publicly, the two sides remain far apart. Guaido-led opposition demand new presidential elections and an end to what they call the Maduro dictatorship. Maduro-led Venezuelan government has so far not given any indication of giving up power.
Hoy Venezuela padece.
Today, Venezuela is suffering from a dictatorship. The world needs to recognize this. Venezuela can no longer be considered a democracy in the world. It's a dictatorship.
Que las Naciones Unidas.
Despite their differences, both Maduro and Guaido are under mounting pressure to reach an agreement. The opposition, led by Guaido, who has been recognized by more than 50 countries, including the US, as Venezuela's rightful ruler, is running out of time and potentially steam. Meanwhile, a severe economic crisis has exacerbated, and shortages of food and medicines have grown even more acute in Venezuela. United Nations figures suggest 4 million people have fled the country since 2015. Harsh US sanctions and growing international isolation have hit Maduro's government hard. The Maduro government blames the shortages on US sanctions, but the opposition says they are down to years of mismanagement. Will the talks restore normalcy in the country? That only time will tell. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
This week, Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam attempted to end what has been the territory's worst political crisis in decades by declaring that a controversial extradition bill that set off weeks of protests was dead. However, protesters panned her word games, saying that the bill was not withdrawn from Parliament. Now, they have vowed to organize further protests if she refused to meet their demands. Weeks of standoffs are also posing a fresh risk to Hong Kong's international reputation as an attractive place to do business.
has a long-standing protest culture that is peaceful. But recent acts of vandalism have jolted the city. This was a turbulent month of protests and rallies joined by millions to fight against a proposed law that would allow individuals to be extradited to stand trial in China's courts. On Tuesday, Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam said that the extradition bill that sparked the city's biggest political crisis in decades was dead.
We respect citizens' freedom to express their opinions. We will carefully listen to their opinions and refer to these opinions for our policy making later.
But the protesters are not reassured by her personal promise, which they said was no guarantee that the bill would not be revived later. They continue to demand that the government fully withdraws the bill, releases all those arrested in protest, and launches an independent investigation into police use of tear gas, rubber bullets, and truncheons on largely peaceful crowds. Hong Kong activists on Thursday laid sunflowers and white lilies at a memorial site for a man who fell to his death during recent protests.
What Mr. Leung did last month was really to sacrifice his own life in order to denounce this government. There is no way we'll forget the blood that has been spilled. So we really must do something to make this government change.
Protesters have seized the opportunity to make a larger point about Hong Kong's autonomy, making fresh demands. Activist Joshua Wong, who was one of the leaders of the 2014 Umbrella pro-democracy protest, has demanded right to run in elections. It is noteworthy that under present laws, Hong Kong legislators are subject to being banned from office if they go too far in advocating for Hong Kong's independence.
I have not yet considered whether to participate in the district council elections, but as a person that has spent less than 3 months in prison and aged above 21 years, I should have the rights to participate in elections.
A standoff between the government and protesters is thus likely to continue, which also poses a fresh risk to Hong Kong's international reputation as an attractive place to do business. China has called the protest an undisguised challenge to the one country, two systems model, under which Hong Kong has been ruled for 22 years since it was handed back to China by Britain. The protests have also led to tensions between China and UK after British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt warned of consequences if China neglected its commitments to guarantee basic freedoms. Hong Kong authorities are scrambling to find a solution to the crisis, but the simmering tensions are unlikely to cool down. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
The Australian government has pledged to hold a referendum on recognising Indigenous people in the nation's constitution. Official recognition and rights for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians is a major national debate. The government says it is committed to holding a national referendum within 3 years. Such a vote is required to change the constitution. In 2017, a body of Indigenous people demanded an Indigenous advisory body to be added to the nation's founding document. The Turnbull government at that time rejected that proposal, but the government under Prime Minister Scott Morrison appears open to the idea.
Will Australia recognise its Indigenous people in the nation's constitution? Well, that could be reality in the next 3 years. Indigenous people were living in Australia for more than 65,000 years before British colonisation in 1788. However, the country has struggled to achieve reconciliation with the descendants of its first inhabitants, as they are not recognised in the national constitution. The government now says it will hold a national vote within 3 years on whether to include recognition of Indigenous people in its constitution. With public support on the issue growing, Minister for Indigenous Australians Ken Wyatt, who is the first Indigenous Australian to hold the portfolio, promised a referendum before 2022.
I will develop and bring forward a consensus option for constitutional recognition to put to a referendum during the current parliamentary term. And that means working through until we reach a point in which there is consensus across all the relevant groups that have a stake in this.
Wyatt, however, will need to work out an agreement between the government and Indigenous leaders who have demanded a bigger voice in the running of the country. Prime Minister Scott Morrison's Conservative coalition government was returned to power in May, and an agreement needs to be worked out before the next polls in 2022. Also, Wyatt says he would not put forward a referendum if he did not believe it would succeed. Of the 44 referendums held since Federation, just 8 have succeeded. The referendum question would need to be supported by a majority of voters nationally and by at least 4 out of 6 states.
All they want is for governments to hear their issues, stories and their matters associated with their land, their history. They're asking the 3 tiers of government to stop and take the time to listen to their voices. The development of a local, regional and national voice will be achieved.
Indigenous Australians account for about 7 lakh people in a total population of 23 million and are near the bottom in almost every socio-economic indicator, suffering disproportionately high rates of suicide, alcohol abuse, domestic violence and imprisonment. In 2017, Indigenous leaders proposed establishing an advisory body made up of elected Indigenous Australians, but the government rejected the proposal. The government has come under growing pressure since then to revisit the issue, with several corporate giants insisting that meaningful recognition is the only way to bridge the divide in Australia's population. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Well, time to wrap up the program, but before we go, take a look at the visuals of the World Wife Carrying Championship that was held in the Finnish town of Sonkarvi. The contest where men complete an obstacle course with their wives over their shoulders. Each year, the championship draws thousands of visitors to the town of only about 4,000 inhabitants in the central Finland. Saturday's competition was the 24th year it has been held. And having gained followers across the world, preliminary competitions were held in countries like the US, Australia, Poland and Britain. A Lithuanian couple won the championship for the second time in a row, winning the first prize consisting of the wife's weight in beer. So take a look at the visuals as I take your leave. I'll see you next week in another edition of World Panorama. Bye-bye.